In the quiet corners of southern Russia, a respected youth leader named Anatoly Slivko lived a life that seemed devoted to discipline and mentorship. But behind closed doors, something far darker was unfolding. Over years, he filmed his private rituals in secrecy, constructing a hidden world fueled by obsession and control. When the truth surfaced, it revealed a nightmare concealed beneath ordinary routine, a reminder that sometimes the most disturbing horrors are the ones carefully recorded, frame by frame, in silence. Listen to the full story right now over on my true crime channel, Saturn Soul, link down below. Now enjoy the stories. I grew up in a group home in the Midwest. My foster parents tried, but I hit the road once I turned 18. Now, I worked my way across the country, moving from place to place once I had enough cash in my pocket from working odd jobs. But of all the weird jobs I worked, from fish processor to theme park security, the strangest one of all was up in Alaska, where I worked as a projectionist at a small-town movie theater. Now, I first landed in Anchorage in 1998 and then ended up trekking across the interior to see all Alaska had to offer. I ended up in Fort Yukon for a while, then after heading out about 45 miles northwest, I came to a little town called Venati. It's deep in Indian country, and the tribal government out there was fiercely independent and proud of it. And when you see where they live, you understand why they're so protective over it. I saw more top-tier hunting and fishing spots out there than any other place in America, all surrounding a town of about 180 people, give or take. Now, there are no roads going in or out of town, so you either get there by plane or by trail, or not at all. And then, since the grocery stores run out of stuff pretty quick, a lot of folks live hand-to-mouth either by rifle or rod. There's a lot of wood stoves to save money in the winters, and Lord knows they need them out there. But while we weren't so far north that we got those endless days and nights at either end of the year, we got some killer northern light shows, especially in the deep winter. Venati Village is maybe 95% native, but there's about half a dozen outsiders, mostly from the lower 48, who, like me, ended up landing there one way or another. I remember bumming around for a while just getting to know the place and its tribal culture. And then one day, I got word that the projectionist at the old movie theater was throwing in the towel, and someone was needed to take his place. Now, I didn't know squat about working a projector, but since the pay was decent and no one else was stepping up to the plate on account of how boring it was supposed to be, I figured, why the hell not? Now, I'd really taken a liking to Venati, so I was glad to be sticking around, but I quickly figured out why no one had jumped at the chance to do that job. First off, the movie theater was just a huge semi-soundproof shed with a projectionist platform at the back and a bunch of old church pews and folding chairs to make up the rows of seating. There was no actual heating in there, so aside from an old space heater which just about stopped the whole theater from freezing over, you had to wrap up warm and maybe bring a little vodka if you wanted to get through the night. And then secondly, the library of reels they had was nothing short of abominable. There were a lot of old reels from the 50s and 60s, and not the good ones either. There was one titled The Robot versus the Aztec Mummy, about a mad scientist who had to construct a combat droid to fight off an evil Aztec mummy he accidentally awakened. And then a movie called Earth versus the Spider, which is pretty much what you imagine it to be. The movies were terrible, but no one really cared, and every Saturday night you'd get at least a dozen younger men with beers just hanging out and making fun of whatever crap movie I decided to show. They'd seen all of them 100 times too, so much that they were yelling out lines along with the actors and mimicking the action whenever the robot and mummy were fighting, or when the cops were trying to kill the spider with a whole bunch of DDT. It was one of their only forms of entertainment, a place friends hung out, a place parents could drop their kids off for a couple of hours whenever the family-friendly stuff was playing on a Sunday. And that means a lot to some of them, and I felt they deserved better. I started a small grassroots campaign, raised a little money for the theater, and then started calling around places in Anchorage and Fairbanks, seeing if anyone had any old movie reels they wanted to part with. Sometimes I'd get a whole bunch of stuff, mostly more of the same bad movies from decades ago, but at least they were new. In one box I got Attack of the Eye Creatures and The Day the Earth Froze, and all the Saturday night moviegoers were thrilled to be able to make fun of a brand new, terrible movie. People actually started showing up to see some of the quote-unquote premieres I'd host, and then as revenue went up, I could afford to fix up the theater a little until the whole thing became sort of like a personal project to me and brought me more joy than I ever thought possible. At least until one night, after closing, when I was going through a box of reels that I got from Fairbanks I hadn't inventoried yet, and I came across an unlabeled can that looked a little different than the rest. It's past midnight, and I was getting pretty tired, but I guess curiosity got the better of me. And so I opened the can, hooked the reel up to the projector, and then hit the motor after shutting off the lights. I'm expecting a title sequence of some kind, even just a vanity plate to let me know who made the movie, but there's nothing like that at all. The film just sort of flashed into life, no sound at all, showing maybe 4 or 5 flaming torches surrounding a big old tree. There was a jump cut, and then to my shock, I saw a masked man with no clothes on start walking around the tree. I say mask, but it was more like a kind of helmet almost. I couldn't make out much detail right then because of the distance between him and the camera, but I could see that there was a part covering his face and hair, and then a whole bunch of sticks or twigs sticking out of the back, like they were hair or a mane or something. He was circling the tree, naked from the neck down, and from the way he was moving his arm, it looked like he was dousing the bark of the tree in some kind of fluid. I might be wrong, and he was just kind of waving whatever was in his hand in its direction, but either way it looked almost ceremonial. I figured that I must have been watching somebody's home movie and that whoever had filmed it was into some pretty freaky stuff. Turns out, that wasn't even the half of it, because after the naked guy finished this little lap around the tree, there was another jump cut, and after a brief moment of seeing nothing but the trees and those flaming torches, a whole bunch of people came walking into frame. The one I'd seen previously was in the lead, and as he walked towards the tree again from off camera, 3 similarly undressed men guided another into the frame. Now this man was naked too, but unlike the men guiding him, who were also wearing wooden helmet masks, this man's head was bare, and he was also showing a great deal of difficulty in walking. Now it was like he'd either been drugged or was drunk out of his mind, but either way, he didn't seem to protest as the masked men urged him forward. And then when they got him in the trunk, they turned him around and then started tying what looked like rope around his wrists. The guy wasn't struggling at all. He didn't fight back. He just let 2 of the men tie each of his wrists before they walked around the tree out of sight, where they presumably tied the ropes together to hold the man in place. You could kind of see him wobbling in place, but he didn't try to escape, and that's what really put me on guard and left me completely unprepared for what was about to come. There appeared to be another jump cut because after the maskless man's arms were tied, the shot suddenly changed so that one of the masked men was standing in front of them while the others were kneeling in a line closer to the camera. In all the other shots, the maskless man was still but kind of wobbly, whereas in this latest shot, he looked like he was struggling against the ropes. I couldn't see him very well thanks to the guy standing in front of him, but I could see enough to know that he was sort of pulling and tugging on the ropes, trying to get himself free, but he couldn't. The next thing, the man in front starts hitting him. At least it looked like he was hitting him. He did that over and over while the tied man struggled until suddenly, the struggling stopped completely. I thought he might have knocked the guy out or something because you could see him go kind of limp against the tree with only the ropes holding him up. But then, the man in the front stepped out of the way, and what I saw shocked me so much I almost fell out of my chair. The man tied to the tree, the one who'd been wobbly, then still, then struggling, had been mutilated. The naked man with the mask started gesturing to the bloody mess, and the tree-kneeling men started going wild, waving their arms and looking up to the sky. and then the standing man stepping towards the tied one, and from what I could tell, it looked like he started to almost reach into the guy's body. And that was all I could watch, and in a sort of half panic, I turned off the projector and the theater went dark again. I think I sat there for a minute or two in total shock, wondering if what I'd seen was even real. As something of a movie buff, I knew all too well that a clever director could fake something like that, and with those jump cuts being so obvious, I kept telling myself it was all clever editing and special effects. But what I couldn't make sense of was just how convincing the victim had been. How they must have been a damn fine actor to pull off that kind of performance. I also couldn't figure out how the filmmaker managed to get hold of such a convincing prop, because when he stepped away from that butchered body, I hadn't seen anything that realistic in all my movie-watching life. I kept telling myself it wasn't real, that it couldn't have been real. But of all the dumb movie deaths I'd seen and all the dumb movies I'd watched over the past couple of months, nothing prompted that sort of intense, physical reaction in me like seeing that butchered man tied to that tree. I knew I had to do something, even if I took it to the cops who told me it was nothing but an amateur horror movie and I got myself into a panic over nothing, because I'd rather be wrong and relaxed than keep on wondering what the hell I'd just witnessed. And the next morning, I went to talk with Pete, Venetai's VPSO, which stands for Village Public Safety Officer. And these are the folks to assist state troopers in policing the more remote villages, and since he obviously couldn't help the situation much, Pete told me to head into Fairbanks and talk to the troopers there. My next stop was to talk with one of the pilots who flew a daily air taxi down to Fairbanks. Passengers only paid a small fare to cover the pilot's pay, and the fuel came out of the tribal taxation fund so that everyone could afford to get to Fairbanks for all that kind of stuff. And this meant all I needed to do was buy a ticket, wait for the next flight, and then an hour later we were landing in Fairbanks. I was hungry, and I had a bunch of stuff I needed to do while I was there, but all that needed to wait until I'd stopped by the state trooper building. The guy I talked to said anything that happened up in Indian country was covered by the Rural Services Unit, and if I didn't mind waiting, he could get one of their 2 RSU troopers back to headquarters so I could talk with him. And that was how I met a trooper named Sheldon Yazzie. Yazzie was a great big bear of a man with tan skin, dark eyes, and one heck of a hairline too. He wore a black mustache and goatee, and he wore them well too, but he also had this smile that lit up the room and made me instantly feel at ease, even with that movie reel sitting in my backpack. I asked him if we could talk in private, so he walked me into the tiny rural services office that he had there. Then after taking a seat, I took that reel out and told him what was on it. As you can imagine, he lost that bright smile of his as I went over what I saw. I told him how I could tell from the quality of the recording that it had to be at least 20 years old, and there was no sound to go with it, so I didn't hear any names or voices. But he agreed that if it was real, then it sure as hell needed to be investigated. And since I didn't have a phone where I was staying, Yazzie said that he'd call the Venetai Tribal Council building if he had any updates for me. And then after shaking his hand, I went about my business in Fairbanks and then flew back up to Venetai late in the afternoon. I checked back in with Pete, the village public safety officer that I mentioned before, telling him all about handing that reel over as evidence. We still didn't know where it came from and only roughly when it was made, so we each decided it was best to keep quiet about me finding it and simply wait for a call from Yazzie to find out what the state troopers had to say. And then a few days later, one of the staff from the village council came over to the movie theater and said I had a call waiting from the cops over in Fairbanks. I know I must have turned a few heads running all the way across the road, but I didn't want to keep Trooper Yazzie waiting, and I also figured that it was too soon to have cracked the case, but I assumed that he might have something for me. But unfortunately on that part I was wrong. Yazzie said he and his superior had the displeasure of watching the reel together on a projector they borrowed from someone. And then by the time it had finished, every state trooper in the building was packed into that dark conference room with their eyes glued to what was happening on that big white wall in front of them. They were horrified, as they should have been, and their first port call was the Fairbanks junk shop that I sourced the box of reels from. Unsurprisingly, the owner apparently had nothing to do with the crimes and couldn't even remember where in the heck the reel had come from. He said people call by to drop stuff off and pick things up all the time, with some coming as far as Delta Junction or Grant Creek. There was no way he'd be able to ID the person who brought it in, and since there were no security cameras around his store, there was no going through it to figure out who did. They did get a couple of clues though, not much, but it was something. First off, the tree the victim was tied to was ID'd as a white spruce, the most common kind of tree in Alaska's uplands. White spruce are also common around the Great Lakes in New England, but since the reel apparently came from Fairbanks, there was a really good chance that the reel had been filmed in Alaska. Now, the reel wasn't manufactured in Canada, but it was made back in the mid-70s, which not only lined up with the time I figured it was filmed, but also lined up with a couple of people going missing from Anchorage and the surrounding towns over the course of about 4 or 5 years. I remember feeling my stomach drop as I realized what Trooper Yazzie was saying, that some goddamned murder cult had been operating around Anchorage in the 70s, and that what we'd seen might have constituted just one of half a dozen separate murders. The only prints they were able to pull off the can were that of the junk shop owner and another set of unidentified prints that they assumed were mine. Yazzie asked if I minded stopping by the Fairbanks AST building next time I was in town so I could be fingerprinted. I did as he asked, and the prints were confirmed to be mine. Now, while I was there, I asked Yazzie where'd they go from there, like if they had any way of chasing up leads or tracking down clues, and his response was disappointing to say the least. I know they had nothing to go on in terms of who was doing the killing in that home movie, but I'd really hoped that chasing up serial numbers and whatnot would yield results. And so when I was basically told, keep ordering boxes of reels and keep us updated if you find anything else, I'm thinking, wait, it's down to me to go hunting for other reels? And that's not what Yazzie was asking me. It sure as hell felt like it at the time, but that's not what he was asking. They just figured that rather than put all the time and resources into sourcing every unlabeled film can in Alaska, it'd be better to just circulate word of what they'd found and hope someone, somewhere, found something. Trooper Yazzie had been really helpful on the phone, and I knew it wasn't his call to just do nothing about the home movie murder, but I was still hugely frustrated at the response by the state troopers. I guess it wasn't even their fault either, because they had superiors to deal with, and it was probably them that determined there wasn't enough to warrant a full, funded investigation. At least not until they had more than one reel and more than exactly 0 avenues of investigation they had at that moment. And so while I did kind of resent having to do it, I went into overdrive in terms of sourcing movie reels from places, calling as far as Anchorage, but also Vancouver and Seattle to see what I could get my hands on. I received more shipments of reels brought in by the Venetai air taxi than I ever had before, but even after months and months of searching and sourcing, I didn't find a single other unlabeled reel, let alone one with similar contents as the first. I had to wait years, literally years, before I came across another unlabeled film can, but when I did, even with all that time having passed, it was like I could feel the color draining from my face. It was the spring of 1999 when I found that first can of film, and I didn't find the second until late summer of 2001. But the moment I set eyes on it, I practically ran to the projector, hooked up the film, and fired up the motor after turning the lights out. There was that same long wait before any picture showed up, not title cards or vanity plates or anything like that, and I found myself both hoping it was from the same people, while at the same time hoping it was just nothing. But then the second I saw flaming torches flash onto the screen, lighting up the dark night around them, I knew it was from the same sick bastards who made that first tape I saw. The torches weren't surrounding a tree this time. They were all lined up on either side of what looked to be a huge teepee made of hundreds of wooden sticks. There were 2 more torches by the entrance, and just guessing, that thing must have been maybe 15 feet tall and just as wide. It was no small construction, and then as I'm looking at it, wondering just how long it'd take to put something like that together, there's a jump cut, and another one of those naked guys appears wearing one of those wooden helmet things. He walks up to the opening of the huge stick-made teepee thing, and then, after picking up one of the torches, he walks inside and starts lighting the inner walls on fire. I could see the orange glow pick up in the darkness as the flames took, turning the dark inside of the teepee this terrible orange. And I figured the guy'd walk out slowly, just as slowly as he walked in, but he didn't move. There was a jump cut and more of the teepee was on fire, the flames rising as the sticks caught and the thing started to burn in earnest. And then at the same time, what I believe to be the same three figures as the first movie came walking into the shot, each wearing the same thing as the last time. I could see the guy who lit the teepee on fire, standing perfectly still inside of it, still holding his torch. There must have been quite a lot of smoke and heat in that thing too, but the guy didn't seem to move a muscle. And seconds later, the three approaching figures each filled into the teepee's interior along with him. There was another jump cut, showing the teepee all the way up in flames, and again I could clearly see all four figures inside of it. They must have been roasting alive in there, but they didn't seem to be moving a muscle. And then just as I started to wonder if what I was seeing was real, there was another cut to show the teepee collapsing in a shower of flames and sparks. I showed Pete the VPSO, and while he seemed shocked at first, watching those freaky-looking nudists walking into the burning teepee, he had the same reaction I did at one of those final jump cuts. He asked how he could be sure that those dudes were still inside once it was really burning, and how they might have used a little clever editing to make it look like they were. And he made a great point, and my first thoughts involved them faking their own deaths or something along those lines to throw the cops off their trail. Pete said that was impossible, but we still couldn't rule anything out, and the most important thing was getting the can of film to the state troopers in Fairbanks. Again, I thought the cops might be able to get some kind of clue from that reel. Like maybe they'd gotten reports of other huge sick teepees like that so they could sort of, I don't know, triangulate the place that they were operating out of. Now I knew that they could track serial numbers, check shipments and all that kind of stuff, so once again I found myself hoping my contribution might crack this case. But as it turned out, handing that tape over did way more harm than good. Yazzie explained how his superiors had reacted much the same as we had to all those sudden jump cuts towards the end of the footage, and instead of going with my theory that the whole thing was meant to confuse law enforcement, they started openly questioning whether the whole thing was even legitimate at all. Yazzie said one senior trooper suggested it was some film school kids' home movie horror show, and that the whole thing had been a huge waste of time. Besides, even if both movies were real, the second one didn't show any crime but open burning, which for first-timers is nothing but a misdemeanor without the proper permit. And at best, it could be used to tie the men to any of the other crimes that might occur into the future, but without a positive ID on the victim from the first movie, there was nowhere for them to go and nothing for them to do. The burning teepee was just another dead end. Trooper Yazzie said that one trooper floated the idea that it was me who'd made those movies. Fake them, I mean, and scaring folks with them was how I got my kicks. Now, it was only Trooper Yazzie arguing that I didn't seem the type that stopped them flying up to Venati to search where I was staying and have a talk with me. And while I appreciate him fighting my corner in that respect, I was mad as hell at them for making out that I was just some prankster and not someone just honestly trying to help out. Now, once again, there was no real inventory at the thrift store that I purchased the reel from, as once again it came in a set of around 24 old movie reels. The state troopers didn't even pay the place a visit that time, they just called to make sure that there was no record. Meaning for all intent and purpose, the tape could have been my own creation and I was just lying about where it had come from. Yazzie was just as frustrated as I was, but he wasn't surprised. He said Alaska has more unsolved disappearances than any other place in America, so much that people don't even bother looking sometimes. If a kid goes missing in a park or something, that tends to be a big deal. But a grown man, especially someone from the outer states who's not very experienced in the outdoors, people just tend to think, they're a goner, and move on. It's a harsh way to look at things, I guess, but just like Yazzie said, people have found way too many skeletons surrounded by bear scat to have hope someone might still be out there, especially after they've been missing for more than a few days. He said the best we could hope for is that some more of those reels showed up and that they'd showed victims, perps, and locations in more detail, and that's even assuming that there were other victims and that wasn't just the end of the trail right there. I ended up going on another ordering spree, sourcing unlabeled reels and boxes of junk from all over Alaska and the Pacific Northwest, and one time I was awake a whole 24 hours burning through unlabeled cans of film, stuck in that limbo of hoping that I'd get lucky while praying that there weren't any more of those horrifying home movies out there. And then before long, I realized what it was doing to me. My little quest for justice had turned into some blind obsession, and my work at the movie theater was starting to suffer as a result. Now, I'd think about those masked and naked maniacs all goddamn day, and then when I go to bed at night, I'd dream about them too. I started to lose sleep, and I stopped eating. The reels became an obsession, and just about everyone around me could see it too. Pete and the support officer recognized it first, I guess, and told me that maybe, just maybe, my time in Venetai had come to an end and it was time to move on. And I guess he was right. Last time I stayed anywhere for almost 3 years, I was a kid of single-digit ages being raised by a foster family. And maybe that was it. I'd come to the end of my time, and that obsession of mine was just a way of my conscious kind of rebelling against putting down roots. I moved on down to Anchorage, and then with the skills that I picked up in Venetai, I ended up working as a projectionist at a much more professional operation. But there's not a day that goes by where I don't think about those unlabeled film cans, and I don't think I'll ever be able to forget the horrors they contained. I grew up in western Georgia, and for as long as I can remember, I always wanted to be a pilot. I thought about the Air Force for a while, mostly for the speed, but the high discipline environment wouldn't have done me any good. But then once I had about 1,500 hours under my belt, I heard about some pretty lucrative opportunities up north. Way north, too. Like in Alaska. I landed in Anchorage back in 2011 with enough money to bum around for a few weeks, enjoying all that seafood and the clean, cool air they got up there. And then while I was at it, I went around knocking on the doors of a few air taxi outfits and asked if they needed any pilots. I figured positions up there would be majorly competitive given the perks of the job, but I found a vacancy at the third place I called, an operation out of Talkeetna, hauling hunters, fishermen, and mail to remote airstrips. I'd be flying some beat-up old Cessna 180 at first, but I could work my way up to bigger and bigger loads. And then as long as I didn't spook the passengers or bend any metal, I was told that there'd always be work for me up in the land of the midnight sun, as they say. And the best thing about my job, by a country mile, was the freedom you got up there. You're basically an independent contractor, so not quite your own boss, but close enough to get all the benefits. And then cruising over all those jagged peaks and glaciers, all God's own artwork, it makes every single flight feel like a brand new adventure. On a clear day, you can spot moose from 500 feet up, with all those puffy white clouds off in the distance looking like floating mountain ranges for miles either side of you. You feel like a real maverick too sometimes, landing on gravel bars or frozen lakes that'd make most spit-shined airline pilots piss their pants. But then there are the downsides, the primary one being the weather. I've never flown anywhere that can turn from a bluebird to a whiteout in a matter of mere minutes. 1 second, it's chilly but otherwise a manageable flight, and then the next thing, you're dodging ice like it's taken a deep and personal disliking to you. One bad call on fuel or wind, and you're toast. And even if you do somehow manage to land safely in the great American wilderness, you're hiking back to base with a hungry bear on your trail most likely. Because out there, walking with a limp or an open wound is like walking around with a big old sign above your head saying, "Dinner is served." Parts take forever to ship to Alaska from manufacturers, so maintenance is always a pain in the ass. And sometimes it's so lonely out there with nothing but your VHF radio that you actually miss having some babysitter in air traffic control checking in to bother you every couple of minutes. And that kind of brings me around to one of the hairiest scrapes I ever had up there almost 9 years ago now, back in the early fall of 2017. It was September 6th, a Wednesday to be exact, and I was flying a whole bunch of supplies from Bethel up to a camp near the Yukon River in my old 185 on skis. Oh, and the skis part refers to these hydraulic wheel skis that we use for snowy conditions, because you can't use regular landing gear on a snowpack. Now anyway, the weather brief said marginal VFR, meaning that there was a high risk of encountering low ceilings, fog, and generally poor visibility, particularly in the more mountainous areas. But with ceilings dropping fairly low, I figured that I could at least dodge the very worst of it. Once she was all loaded up, I hopped into my 185 and got her up in the air with no problems. And then for about 40 minutes or so, everything was going just fine as I'm weaving between patches of cloud like I've done 1,000 times before. And then suddenly, my luck ran out, and I was faced with a cloud bank right up in front of me, no dodging it, and it looked as thick as potato soup. It looked like nothing but a whole bunch of rain clouds at first, the kind that are almost filled to bursting with the super cool droplets they get. Now, I thought worst case I'd get a wet windscreen and bad visibility for a minute or two, but then after punching into it and watching almost all the light disappear, my engine started to surge like it was choking, and then it sputtered out altogether. RPM started dropping off, and I grabbed the carb heat up to full before switching fuel tanks, but it was no good. My engine wasn't responding. My instruments are going haywire, and I figured the pitot tube must have been frozen solid because my airspeed's reading 0. And I also heard the telltale vibration of my propellers icing up, which is obviously really bad news because I need them to be able to spin. And the longer I went without engines, the worse the outcome would be. And so it occurs to me that I might have to ditch in the bush, in which case I might as well end up as bear bait. Oh, and it might sound crazy, but we generally don't wear parachutes, as going down with a plane can sometimes be a hell of a lot safer than parachuting into trees or into a mountain. Anyway, my main concern is that I'm about to start augering in, which is basically when a plane starts plummeting to the ground while spinning really fast. Now my control stick doesn't seem to be responding at all, which should have meant that I was in big trouble and I was about to start free-falling. But when I looked at the altitude, it was holding steady. I remember thinking it was possible that the ice was messing with the static, but just like the gauge suggested, the plane kept sailing along smooth as silk through the clouds. Now, I can't overstate what little sense that made to me, and it wasn't like I was some newbie greenhorn who couldn't interpret my dials and gauges. No engine meant no power meant no propellers, and no propellers meant that I should have been quickly losing altitude. And yet, somehow, I was still cruising along like nothing had happened and my plane was working just fine. Because that seemed impossible, and on the assumption that I was losing altitude, I tried to drop the flaps to slow my bird down. But for some reason my controls were almost completely unresponsive. The yoke, which is what we call the control stick, was barely budging, but I hadn't been without RPMs for long enough for the hinges on my flaps to be locked up with ice. And that's the point where I really start to panic. I've been nervous from the very start of it, but the fear only hit when I realized that even with what must have been 1,800 flight hours by that point, I had absolutely no idea what was going on. I fell back on my training, feeling myself sweating in spite of the cold as the fear and adrenaline pumped through my blood. I ran through the restart checklist in my head, which is part of our emergency procedures to regain engine power after an in-flight engine failure or a flameout. Now, I'd just about reached the 6th step in ensuring my throttle was slightly open, when out of nowhere, this whole airframe started shaking like a chihuahua taking a dump. I'd never been so scared as I was then when my plane started to shake like that. I mean, shaking is the wrong word. It was more like it was vibrating in midair. It was so rough that I genuinely thought, like, this is it, and that at any moment I was going to watch my plane start to rattle apart at the seams. My whole body was vibrating along with it, and I had to grit my teeth to keep from chattering as I kept hearing the ping, ping, ping of icicles slinging off the prop and pinging against the fuselage. It's hard to overstate just how screwed it seemed I was, and I remember thinking that I was a goddamned fool for listening to all the old salts who told me a parachute just meant a long, slow, and painful death, either freezing up on a mountainside or getting eaten alive by some animal. I'd have given my whole damn nutsack for a parachute in that moment. But then, just as all hope seemed lost and that feeling of despair was set to overwhelm me completely, my plane suddenly broke through the cloud into all clear ahead, and my engine suddenly coughed back to life. The power surged, my controls loosened up, and then after quickly leveling off and checking all of my gauges twice, I think I just about lost my mind for a second. I remember yelling, "Atta girl, there you go baby, there she is," and then laughing my ass off as the engine began to hum all nice and loud again. It was the second greatest feeling of relief and happiness I'd ever felt, second only to the one I felt when my now wife gave birth to a healthy baby girl. I felt like the luckiest son of a bitch to ever grace the skies. But then, knowing my luck must be seriously running dry after such a close call, I used my map to locate the nearest airstrip and then immediately made a beeline for it. I managed to raise someone down there on my radio so they were expecting me when I brought my plane in, and managed to land her with the greasy side down. But when I climbed out and started stumbling over to what passed for the pilot's lounge, my knees were just about knocking together from the adrenaline dump as I trudged through the snow. An older man, who turned out to be an airplane mechanic, came out into the snow to greet me as I got closer. I was so shaken up that I could barely talk, but after getting me inside, pouring me a stiff drink, and then sitting me down in front of a warm fire for a while, I started to feel like my old self again. There was another guy in there who I think was just a friend of the mechanic, and they both sat in stunned silence as I told them what just happened to me. I knew neither of them were pilots, so I tried to make it as clear as possible just how weird it all was, and how I'd never encountered anything like it in all my thousands of hours of flying. But as it turns out, it wasn't the first time either of my two companions had heard of something like that happening to a bush pilot up there. The mechanic said that he was originally from Idaho, and he'd been fixing up light aircraft in Alaska for some 20-odd years, and in his experience, strange stuff like that occurred a lot more than anyone liked to admit. He said as long as he'd been up there, the pilots had been telling him weird stories about all kinds of different stuff, be it seeing strange crafts flying past them at supersonic speeds, or having their aircraft start acting funny when, just like me, they passed through what they thought was just a rain cloud. He said the strangest of the stories come from those who fly at night, how they talk of strange lights in the sky, disappearing from one place and then appearing again in another in the blink of an eye. When they were just about done going over all that strange crap they'd heard over the years, the engineer and his buddy told me that I was lucky to have landed my plane, and that it's not uncommon for pilots to take to the skies only to never to be heard from again. I waited a couple of more hours for the weather to clear, and then I kept on towards my destination with no further problems. But I've never forgotten what happened that day, and sometimes I get a cold sweat seeing a particularly dark set of storm clouds, because if I'm ever unlucky enough to have a second run-in with whatever happened that day, I might end up as one of those pilots that's never heard from again. Longtime listener here from Anchorage, Alaska. And while I spent most of my life down here, I grew up on the far western coast in a place called Point Hope. Living in Point Hope felt like you were living in this frozen bubble at the very edge of the world, far from anything warm, cool, or relevant. It felt like no one else in America knew that we were out there. Heck, even the sun forgets about us for a month each year, and as you can imagine, winters were bad, even for Alaska. Some years the whole town would end up buried under 7-foot snowdrifts, and sometimes the wind would come in so hard off the sea that it wasn't safe to go outside. School would be canceled if it dipped below -40, which happened at least 24 times growing up, and even on the nicer days, we'd bundle up in these giant parkas that made us all look like different colored Kennys from South Park. We'd build snowmen and snow shelters out in our front yards, or at least try to anyway, because half the time they'd collapse on us and we'd end up having snowball fights till our fingers went numb through our gloves. In terms of demographics, there's a big Inupiaq element in town, so I grew up hearing all kinds of stories from elders about the times that came before. We were told how before the gold rush, people would survive on nothing but seal or caribou meat, and times had changed so much that the Iditarod mushers now rolled through town on fancy sleds made of feather-light alloys instead of the more traditional wood, rope, and tuss. Now, we used to hear some incredible stories of tough hearts and sharp minds, but we also heard a few creepy ones too, and for me, there was none more creepy than the story of what happened to a kindly older elder named Kimmick. Now, back during the time of my grandparents, so the 40s and 50s, Uncle Kimmick, as they called him, lived out on the vast, wide-swept tundra to the east of Point Hope. He was a gentle, middle-aged man whose weathered face told the story of the life he lived, and wherever he went, he'd be wearing his thick fur-lined parka made from caribou hide, and at a time when everyone was wearing fancy, down-insulated coats, he cut a very prominent figure around town. His name meant dog in his language, and while I understand that to be an insult in a lot of cultures, to Uncle Kimmick it was the highest kind of compliment, because his one great love in life were his dogs. Uncle Kimmick was an expert at tending to his team of 8 loyal sled dogs. They were a mix of huskies and malamutes with all sorts of thick coats, loud voices, and boundless energy. He treated each one and every one of them like family and fed them scraps of seal and fish that he hunted, even if it meant that he himself had to sometimes go without. He was a tough man, a survivor, but Uncle Kimmick was also known around Point Hope for being the sweetest old man you could ever hope to meet. He'd stop and talk with people whenever he came into town in a sled, and any trouble you'd had, he'd be there to help mend a fishing net or offer his sage advice on carving ivory. Point Hope's residents didn't see him much during the summertime. He had all the hares, berries, and seagull wine he could drink. Look it up, by the way. But during the long polar nights in the winter time, when the sun disappears for around 31 days, Uncle Kimmick used to mush his dogs into town at least once a week to pick up supplies. It's not pitch black all the time, and for a few hours around midday, the skies turn these sort of soft shades of red, violet, and amber and gold for just a few glorious hours. It really does make for an incredible sight to see, but for the rest of the time, it's complete darkness outside. As you can imagine, people look to just about anything to raise their spirits, so I believe them when they say that Uncle Kimmick visits were celebrated. Kids would flock to pet the dogs, and shopkeepers would have his supply order set aside. Flour for palaga bread, ammunition to keep him safe, and tea to help keep him warm at night when the temperatures really dipped. He preferred the solitude of his isolated sod-roofed cabin that he kept warm with seal oil lamps, but sure loved those trips and would often stick around town for a few hours talking to folks after trading for his supplies. But then one day, in the late afternoon after the skies had gone dark again, Uncle Kimmick took off into the tundra again while waving everyone goodbye. But as he disappeared into the darkness, and with the light of his sled getting smaller and smaller, the people of Point Hope saw a lightning storm suddenly burst into life in front of them. It was my grandpa who told me the story, and not only did he claim to have witnessed that lightning storm with his own 2 eyes, he said it was the single eeriest thing he had ever seen. He wasn't the only one to see it. He spoke to plenty of older people who remembered that strange electrical storm, and the reason everyone remembered the storm as so strange was because of how silent it was. There was no greater gusts of wind and no thunderclaps after each fork of lightning struck, but that's actually very explainable, as thunder only tends to travel around 15 miles before the sound drops off. Everyone in town saw it as one of the many strange sights the far north has to offer, then went about their business as normal. About a week went by, and everyone was looking forward to Uncle Kimmick's return. They figured that he must be running low on the old firewater because everyone loves a drink when it's night all goddamn day. But Kimmick didn't show, and after 3 days of getting more and more worried about him, a group of volunteers went off into the tundra to go look for him. They wrapped up warm, gathered up their high-powered flashlights, and then after taking off on ski-doos and dog sleds of their own, they got about 10 miles before they found Uncle Kimmick's sled. The sled was lying on its side, the handrails all smashed up by something, and then his dog harness was empty too, with all 8 of them having been scattered to the winds. They're not tied or locked into the harness, so that wasn't all that shocking, considering the sled itself had turned over, and at first, Uncle Kimmick was nowhere to be found. But then, maybe only 100 yards or so from where his turned-over sled was, they started finding pieces of his clothes all torn up. And then finally, they found him, or at least what was left of him anyway. The man's clothes had been shredded, but even so, there wasn't much left of him to cover up. The men who found him said it looked like he'd been eaten by a polar bear, one that had probably shared him with its cubs, but unless it happened to ambush him pretty good, which is real hard out there in the treeless tundra, then it wasn't a bear that got him. It must have been his dogs. Some of the other guys who found him said the damage to his skin and bones made it look like a frenzied and sustained attack from more than a couple of animals. But there was no confusing that till they found the escaped dogs and analyzed their droppings. The same group of volunteers went off searching for them, and with the dogs being hungry and staying as a very loud pack, it shouldn't have been all that hard to find them. But here's the kicker. Not a single one of old Uncle Kimmick's sled dogs was ever found. Not then, not in the future, not ever. After they found his body, people started connecting his death to the weird lightning storm that happened that night. People said it must have spooked his dogs and that he must have been right in the middle of that lightning storm when it came down, or at least close enough to the strikes that it scared the ever-living crap out of them. And that's the only reason people could believe Kimmick's sled dogs might attack him, that they must have been out of their minds with terror. But he loved those dogs like family, and everyone knew how much they loved him back. But even if Uncle Kimmick did get struck by lightning, which is what some folks believe, it'd take a whole lot of starving before his dogs saw fit to eat him, and they most definitely wouldn't have done it right away. But if that truly is the case, then what the hell happened out there? And what the hell happened to Uncle Kimmick's dogs? They never found any of their remains out there, and no one in any of the distant towns reported a pack of stray sled dogs running through their town. So then, where the hell did they go? No one ever did figure out what happened to old Uncle Kimmick, and in the years that followed, people were extra careful about where they traveled after dark and when, especially during the polar nights, when it seemed like something just might be lurking out there among the endless dark of the Alaskan tundra. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations as I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. And there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday night. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.